Beneath the glittering chandeliers of New York's Gilded Age, where fortunes were flaunted and reputations destroyed with a whisper, a young woman steps into a ballroom meant only to humiliate her. Dressed in a faded gown, Jennie Whitford becomes the cruel joke of the evening, until a single man, a steel magnate with a secret past, dares to change everything with one dance. From mockery to scandal, from silence to power, this is a love story forged in fire and tested against the weight of society's judgment. Tell me, where are you listening to this story from? And do you believe true love can truly conquer pride, envy, and the cruelty of high society? New York City, winter of 1883. The city was a theater of contrasts, where the shrill sound of carriage wheels on icy cobblestones mixed with the glow of gaslight spilling from Fifth Avenue mansions. In this world of marble facades and hidden cruelties, Jennie Whitford moved like a shadow inside her aunt's grand townhouse on East 64th Street, a guest tolerated but never embraced. The air within those rooms smelled faintly of lavender polish and cold silver. Portraits of long-dead ancestors stared down at her from gilded frames, reminders of a lineage whose fortune had evaporated like mist on a frozen morning. Jennie's fingers, slender and pale, moved across the embroidery she had been mending by candlelight. The once velvet draperies hung heavy and dark, their splendor fading with age, like her position in this household. She was 23, with hazel eyes that held a muted radiance, a soft brown chignon at the nape of her neck, and a dignity that survived the quiet humiliations of dependence. Aunt Prudence's voice floated from the adjoining parlor, sharp and measured, scolding a maid about the placement of cutlery, while her cousin's laughter rose like a silvery chime, bright and mocking. Jennie had learned to endure both the cold and the mirth. It was during such an evening, with snowflakes swirling outside the frosted panes, that the invitation arrived. Heavy cream paper, embossed in gold with the name Vanderbilt, lay on the escritoire like a promise and a threat. Her cousin Eleanor breezed into the room, cheeks flushed from the cold, and laid the envelope before her with a smile too sweet to be kind. "For you, dear Jennie," she said, her eyes gleaming. "The winter ball of the season. You will come, won't you?" There was a pause, filled with unspoken meanings. Jennie felt the weight of the card before even touching it, sensing the trap within its elegance. Aunt Prudence appeared soon after, adjusting her pince-nez spectacles. "Do remember, child," she murmured, "not to bring shame upon this household. One appearance at such an event can ruin what little standing you have left." Her words carried a chill sharper than the February wind. Jennie's cheeks flushed, though she did not lift her gaze. She understood the warning, yet also the underlying insult, that she was both an obligation and a risk. Later, in the small chamber that served as her refuge, Jennie unfolded the invitation with trembling hands. The script curled across the page like an invitation from another world, the Vanderbilt Winter Ball. She could almost hear the violins and see the glittering chandeliers, the pearls on satin necks, the polished floors, ready for waltzes she had not danced in years. Her heart pounded, not with excitement, but with a tightening resolve. She knew why they had invited her. They wanted to watch her falter in a borrowed realm, to laugh as she tried to hold her own among women clothed in Parisian silk and crowned with diamonds. She walked to the wardrobe, opening it to reveal a single ivory gown wrapped in tissue, its once lustrous fabric dulled by time. She touched it with the tenderness one might give a fading photograph. The lace at the neckline had yellowed. The skirt lacked the fullness of the current fashion's bustles, and the hem had been patched in secret. It was all she had, and yet, as she held it up before the mirror, she felt an unexpected surge of pride. Her reflection was pale, yes, but her spine straightened, her chin lifted. No laughter could strip that away. The door creaked open, and Aunt Prudence entered, her face set in a severe mask. "I trust you know what you are doing," she said, glancing at the gown with something between pity and contempt. "Do not embarrass us, Jennie." Better to decline than to go and make a spectacle of yourself. Jennie met her aunt's eyes, and for the first time that winter there was a glint of defiance in her hazel gaze. "I will go," she said softly, her voice steady but warm. "And I will not embarrass you." She folded the dress back into its paper and set it carefully on the chair, as if sealing a pact with herself. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the city in silence, but inside Jennie's heart there was a flicker of something unyielding, something that would not be mocked. The Vanderbilt estate stood like a palace carved from frost, its towering marble columns glistening beneath the gaslit street lamps of Fifth Avenue. Snow fell in delicate spirals, blanketing the city in silence, but within those gilded doors, the air pulsed with violins, perfume, and the hum of ruthless elegance. It was the winter event of the year, where fortunes were flaunted, matches were made, and reputations could rise or be crushed with a glance. Inside, beneath soaring ceilings painted with cherubs and constellations, the grand ballroom shimmered like a living jewel. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the polished floor, reflecting off silk gowns and diamond tiaras. Peacocks of society glided beneath garlands of white roses and ivory ribbons, their laughter crisp, rehearsed, and often cruel. Here, opulence was not just expected, it was weaponized. Jennie Whitford stood at the top of the staircase for a breathless moment, her gloved hands trembling lightly as she took in the splendor below. The scent of jasmine and champagne clung to the air. Her dress, the same faded ivory gown she had carefully pressed that afternoon, clung to her like a memory from a past life. It lacked the bustle so en vogue, and its hem brushed her ankles with humble honesty. Around her, women shimmered in amethysts, emerald velvets, and Parisian taffeta. Their bodices sparkled with seed pearls, and their fans snapped open like wings in motion. She descended slowly, her chin lifted, her hazel eyes calm despite the tension coiling in her chest. The orchestra struck the opening chords of a waltz. Beneath her feet, the marble floor echoed faintly with each step, as if the very house took note of her presence. She moved with quiet dignity, though each swish of her modest skirt felt louder than it ought to be. Whispers rippled almost instantly. "Oh dear, is that the Whitford girl?" She came. How bold. Did she think no one would remember? Jennie passed two debutantes who smirked behind their feathered fans, their silken sleeves brushing as they leaned close to whisper. One looked her up and down with a predatory gleam. Another, more theatrical, let out a small gasp and covered her mouth. Jennie did not falter. She had known this would come. She had rehearsed it in her mind a dozen times, but the sting of it, cold and cutting, was something no preparation could dull. She made her way to the far side of the ballroom, where fewer eyes fell and fewer invitations reached. A corner, near a statue of Hebe, the goddess of youth, offered her a vantage point and a sliver of solitude. There she stood, fingers clasped before her, eyes observing the whirl of silk and status before her, as one might study a storm from the safety of a distant window. The gentlemen passed her by with polite indifference, their eyes sliding over her like she were a maid who had wandered in by mistake. No hand reached for hers. No voice asked her to dance. Instead, they circled the heiresses, the daughters of bankers, the cousins of senators, women swathed in fortune and family names that opened doors. Jennie's name, though noble in origin, was now little more than a whisper of failure. Across the room, seated in regal poise on a damask chaise, Clara Van Allen sipped from a crystal flute. Her emerald gown glittered like envy itself, clinging to her curves with calculated artistry. Her red gold hair was coiled in a masterpiece of braids and pins, a diamond comb catching the chandelier's fire with every turn of her head. At her side sat a small court of socialites, their painted lips smiling in wicked delight. Clara leaned toward her friend, and in a voice just loud enough to carry, said, "One would think she's wandered in from the servants' hall. That colour was fashionable 5 years ago, In mourning, soft laughter bloomed like poison roses. Jennie heard it, but did not turn. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the dancers, a vision of grace and power, of wealth made flesh. She watched as couples spun beneath the chandeliers, the men in starch collars and white gloves, the women in tulle and silk that swirled like clouds. And then, like the shifting of a tide, everything in the room changed. From the shadows beyond the dancers, a tall man stepped forward. His black evening coat cut a sharp silhouette, his white cravat impeccable against the dark lines of his waistcoat. He moved, not like a man seeking company, but like one used to commanding it. His presence alone silenced 3 conversations. He was Edwin Rockwell, the steel magnate whose name appeared in every financial column, whose empire stretched from the Pennsylvania hills to the railroad tracks of the West. At 38, Edwin carried the gravity of a man who had shaped his world with fire and iron. His face bore the marks of years spent in foundries before ballrooms, angular, weathered, yet refined. His eyes, a stormy blue-grey, swept the room not in search of amusement but meaning, and they stopped on her. Jennie did not see him at first. She was too preoccupied with appearing unbothered, too focused on holding the invisible line between composure and collapse. But when she finally looked up, their eyes met across the dance floor. Something in her heart stuttered. Edwin studied her with the same intensity he might have given to a column of numbers or the structure of a new bridge. But it was not pity that lit his gaze. It was interest, not in her shame nor her dress, but in her stillness, in the way she stood alone, unflinching beneath the sneers, in the proud tilt of her chin and the quiet resignation in her eyes. He handed off his glass to a passing footman and began to cross the ballroom. Like a current moving through still water, the room stirred. Whispers returned, but this time with a different flavor: confusion, curiosity, disbelief. He's going toward her. No. That can't be. Not Rockwell. Jennie, noticing the shift in the air, turned and froze. He was walking straight toward her. Each step was measured, assured. He did not glance at the women who vied for his attention, nor at the men who parted to let him pass. When he stopped before her, she felt the full weight of every gaze upon them. He inclined his head, just slightly. "Miss Whitford," he said, his voice low, smooth and warm like brandy, "would you honor me with this dance?" For the briefest second, silence pressed against her ribs. She searched his eyes, unsure if this was yet another trick, another cruelty wrapped in a different voice. But what she found there was something solid, something unexpected: respect. Jennie curtsied, her hand trembling as she placed it into his. His glove was warm, his grip steady. As he led her to the center of the ballroom, the orchestra resumed, almost hesitantly, as if unsure how to accompany a moment they had not rehearsed. And then they danced. Under the golden chandeliers, surrounded by gasps and glares, Jennie moved in the arms of the city's most untouchable man. Her steps, hesitant at first, found rhythm. His presence anchored her, as though he alone stood between her and the abyss. He did not speak beyond the necessary, but in every movement, every pause, every glance that lingered longer than it should, he told her, "I see you. I choose you." Around them, the ballroom churned in confusion and speculation. But within the bounds of that waltz, Jennie Whitford was no longer the poor girl in a faded gown. She was the center of the room. And in the heart of that storm, with Edwin Rockwell's hand steady at her back, she forgot for just a moment the sting of mockery. She had never felt so visible. The orchestra's final note lingered like perfume in the air as Edwin Rockwell released Jennie's hand at the end of their first waltz. A breath, no more than a heartbeat, passed between them before the music resumed, this time with a different melody, slower, heavier with drama. Around them, the ballroom had become a silent opera of lifted brows, clenched fans, and scandalized whispers barely concealed beneath champagne flutes. Jennie Whitford, the girl no one had spoken to an hour earlier, was now dancing with the most powerful man in the room. Again. He extended his gloved hand once more, his gaze locked on hers with a calm intensity that unmoored her. "Shall we?" Jennie hesitated. Every instinct within her warned her to retreat, to slip back into the corner she had occupied like a shadow. But his eyes, a stormy blue-grey touched by something deeper, something almost reverent, compelled her forward. She placed her hand in his once more, and as he led her back into the dance, the room trembled. Their second waltz was not a dance, it was a declaration. Edwin guided her across the polished floor with such ease and precision that Jennie felt as though she were being carried. His presence enveloped her, shielding her from the eyes that followed every step, the mouths that gossiped with barely concealed venom. Clara Van Allen sat frozen near the grand hearth, her lips pressed into a line so thin it threatened to vanish entirely. Others stared as if witnessing something impossible, like a statue come to life, or a scandal unfolding in slow motion. Jennie's gown, though unfashionable, now floated like silk. Her cheeks, flushed with emotion, glowed beneath the gaslight. She moved as if born to be there, graceful, proud, utterly still inside. But within her chest, her heart beat like thunder. What was he doing? Why her? Was this mockery in another disguise, or worse, pity? She dared not ask. When the music faded, Edwin bowed low, his gaze never leaving hers. He did not thank her in the customary manner. Instead, he said softly, "Come with me." Jennie blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly, but he had already offered his arm, and with her breath caught between ribs and heart, she took it. He led her through the edge of the ballroom, down a side corridor lined with gold-framed landscapes and flickering sconces. The distant sounds of the party faded behind velvet curtains. The hush that settled between them was intimate, charged, alive with something Jennie could not name. They entered a gallery, quiet, dim, and empty. Moonlight spilled through tall, arched windows, bathing the marble floor in silver. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft ribbons. Inside, time seemed suspended. Jennie stood at the edge of the window, her hands clasped before her, breathless. Edwin remained a step behind, watching her with the same unwavering focus he might give to a piece of steel just forged, studying not only its surface, but its soul. She turned slowly to face him. Why did you ask me to dance?" she asked at last, her voice no more than a thread. He didn't smile. His expression remained serious, shadowed with thought. "Because I saw something this evening that I haven't seen in years." Jennie tilted her head slightly, her brow creased. "A woman," he said simply, "not an heiress, not a pawn, not a title. A woman who carries herself with dignity even when surrounded by wolves. A woman who does not flinch when she is meant to falter." Jennie's breath caught. She felt exposed, seen in a way no one had allowed her to be since the fall of her family. "I don't understand," she whispered. He stepped closer. "When I entered that ballroom tonight, I was ready to play my part, smile at the right names, dance with the right daughters, pretend I belong in a world that I bought my way into." His voice was deep, steady, but tinged with a weariness that spoke of long battles and lonely victories. "Then I saw you, standing alone, enduring more cruelty than most men would dare face in battle, and yet you did not lower your eyes." Jennie could not move. Her entire being was frozen between disbelief and something dangerously like hope. He took another step, close enough that she could see the faint silver at his temples, the small scar near his jaw, the details no painting could ever catch. "I am a man used to building things from the ground up," he continued. "Railroads, foundries, cities even, but I've never built something with another person beside me. Not truly, not with someone who might face the fire, not just warm herself by it." "Udun," she searched his face, her heart pounding like a runaway carriage. "Why are you telling me this?" His voice dropped. "Because I have a proposal to make, one I do not give lightly." The air turned heavier, charged with something that prickled at her skin. "If I offer you my name," he said, slowly, deliberately. Would you take it, even if the world resents you for it? Jennie's eyes widened. For a moment she thought she had imagined the words, that she had conjured them in some feverish dream, too fragile to exist in the cold light of reason. She took a step back, unsteady. You don't know me. I know enough, he said. Enough to believe that what I saw tonight is not a performance, that the strength in you is not borrowed nor taught, it is forged. Jennie shook her head slightly, her throat tight. They would never accept me. They don't accept me, he said with a dry smile. Not truly. They never have. I am useful to them. My money is welcome. My soul is not, so let them talk. She turned away, trying to steady the storm within her. Miss Whitford, he said gently, I ask for your hand, not to cause scandal, not to shock them, but because I have spent too many years building alone. She turned back to him, her eyes luminous in the moonlight. And you would risk your reputation, she said quietly, for a woman in an old dress. I would risk much more, he said, for a woman who carries herself like a queen even when treated like a servant. She closed her eyes for a single moment, and then, only then, she nodded. Not with girlish joy, not with theatrical delight, but with the quiet resolve of a woman who understood the weight of what had just been placed in her hands. They returned to the ballroom just before midnight. The chandeliers had never shone so brightly. The room hushed once more as Edwin led her to the center floor, not to dance, but to stand before the crowd. He raised his voice just enough to carry, but not so much as to seem theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his arm still linked with Jennie's, permit me a word. Heads turned, fans stilled, champagne froze halfway to lips. I wish to inform you, he said, his voice unwavering, that Miss Jennie Whitford has accepted my proposal of marriage. Gasps, a pause of disbelief, followed by murmurs rising like the tide. Clara Van Allen's glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble. One dowager swooned. A gentleman choked on his cigar, but Jennie stood tall. Her hand in his, her head high, her heart thundering beneath that faded gown. In a single breath, she had gone from mockery to scandal, from forgotten guest to future bride of the city's most powerful man. The world tilted, and Jennie Whitford did not look away. New York City awoke beneath a pale winter sun the morning after Edwin Rockwell's announcement. Gaslight headlines shouted his name in bold letters across broadsheets laid out on the marble counters of tobacconists and cafes. In polished parlors and carriage rides uptown, people whispered as if speaking of a scandalous play rather than two living souls. A magnate's madness, some called it. An upstart's coup, wrote one paper. By noon, the term social upstart clung to Jennie Whitford like a second skin, repeated in columns inked with envy and disdain. Her name, once barely uttered, now drifted like perfumed smoke through drawing rooms and boardrooms alike. Inside Aunt Prudence's townhouse, the atmosphere thickened with a mixture of triumph and dread. Servants moved quickly under sharp orders, and Jennie herself sat before her small dressing table, hands folded over a letter from a milliner she could not afford. No congratulations had come, no warm embraces. Her cousins had disappeared behind closed doors, their laughter replaced by pointed silence. Even Aunt Prudence, who had once cautioned her not to bring shame upon the household, now spoke little, her eyes darting as if fearing contamination by her niece's notoriety. The invitations to luncheons that had trickled in during the season ceased overnight. Ladies who had once allowed Jennie to pour their tea now declined to visit her at all. To the world beyond, she was no longer a poor relation to be pitied, but a threat. An interloper who had crossed the invisible lines of class, daring to be chosen by a man who could have married anyone. Jennie bore it quietly. Her reflection in the mirror revealed not triumph, but an ache she could not name. Her hazel eyes, though luminous, carried shadows at their edges. She touched the lace at her collar, the only adornment she owned besides the cameo brooch. Beneath her fingers, her pulse throbbed like a small drum. Preparations for the wedding began at once. Edwin's solicitors arrived with contracts to sign, arrangements to make, discreet instructions for tailors and florists. It was to be a private ceremony, no cathedral procession, no glittering aisle lined with lilies and jewels, but a quiet exchange of vows at a chapel known for its discretion. The less the world saw, the less ammunition it might have. That was what Edwin's secretary said at least, yet the quieter the arrangements became, the louder the world outside grew. Clara Van Allen's salons hummed with rumour. She told anyone who would listen that Edwin had been driven to folly by boredom, that he sought rebellion against society rather than companionship, that Jennie had snared him with some secret charm. Clara's words dripped into newspapers like ink from a broken pen, staining every corner of conversation. "Mark my words," she was overheard saying, "this will not last. She will have the name, but never the place." Jennie heard of these rumours, but rarely responded. She felt as though she had been placed under glass, watched, discussed, but never touched. When she ventured out for fittings, eyes followed her from behind curtained windows. A seamstress, emboldened by gossip, muttered under her breath while pinning the hem of Jennie's modest travelling dress. Yet Jennie straightened her back, thanked her politely, and walked out into the cold Fifth Avenue wind without flinching. Her dignity was all she had left to wield. Edwin remained a mystery throughout these days. He sent carriages to collect her. He paid every bill. He oversaw every arrangement with impeccable precision. But he did not call upon her at the townhouse except for business. When he did appear, tall and impeccable in his dark coat and grey silk scarf, his demeanour was courteous yet distant, as though a pane of glass separated them. He would inquire after her health, nod at her responses, and then retreat into conversations with his solicitor or the chapel's clergyman. Not once did he speak to her as he had in the gallery on that moonlit night. His gaze, when it did settle on her, carried not coldness but restraint, as if something within him strained against invisible reins. Jennie's heart lived in that silence. She did not ask for more, fearing what answer she might receive. Yet in quiet moments she recalled the warmth of his hand at her back, the steadiness of his voice when he asked his question. That memory became both a comfort and a wound. The day of the wedding arrived like a page torn from another's book. A grey sky hung over the city. Snow lay thick on the cobblestones, muffling the sound of carriage wheels. The chapel stood discreetly on a side street, its stone facade softened by ivy that clung stubbornly even in winter. Inside, the pews were empty, save for a handful of witnesses, Edwin's solicitor, Aunt Prudence in a dark bonnet, and Mrs. Genevieve Baxter, who had arrived quietly and taken Jennie's hand before leading her to a small side room. "You are braver than they know," she whispered, smoothing a fold in Jennie's simple gown of ivory silk. "Hold your head high." Jennie nodded, her throat tight. She had no jewels, no veil of Brussels lace, no train of attendants. Only a sprig of white heather pinned at her bodice, a token from Mrs. Baxter. Her gloved hands trembled as she clasped them before her. In the hallway beyond, Edwin's low voice murmured to the clergyman. She caught fragments of the exchange, words of solemnity, of duty, of haste. When at last she walked into the chapel, the sound of her steps echoed as though through a cathedral. Edwin waited at the altar, tall and composed, his black coat fitting him like armour. His grey eyes flicked to her only once, quickly, before fixing again on the clergyman. He did not reach for her hand until it was time to take his vows. The ceremony lasted no more than a quarter of an hour. Words of union spoken softly, rings exchanged with formal gravity, a prayer murmured over clasped hands. Jennie's voice was steady, though her heart pounded so loudly she feared the others could hear. Edwin's tone was even, each syllable measured like iron weights on a scale. When it was done, there was no applause, no music. Only the clergyman's final blessing and the faint creak of wooden pews as the witnesses rose. They stepped out into the winter air as husband and wife. Snowflakes settled on Jennie's hair and lashes, melting into tiny drops that slid down her cheeks like tears she had not shed. A carriage waited at the curb, its polished black door reflecting the grey sky. Edwin handed her in without a word, his gloved touch polite and brief. He followed, sitting across from her rather than beside her. The space between them felt as wide as the Hudson. The carriage rattled up Fifth Avenue toward his mansion, the seat cushions shifting with each turn. Jennie stared out the window at the gas-lit streets where children played in the snow and vendors hawked roasted chestnuts to passers-by. She felt like a ghost moving through a city that no longer recognized her. Inside, the scent of leather and winter clung to the air. Edwin's gaze flicked to her once or twice, but did not linger. When the carriage stopped before the Rockwell mansion, Jennie drew a breath she did not know she had been holding. The house rose like a fortress of marble and granite, its windows glowing with golden light. A doorman in livery opened the door, bowing deeply. Servants lined the entry hall, silent and stiff as statues. Edwin led her up the steps, his hand lightly at her elbow. "Welcome, Mrs. Rockwell," he said quietly, his tone unreadable. The words sounded like a key turning in a lock. She crossed the threshold. The mansion swallowed her in silence. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting their light on mahogany staircases and Persian carpets. The walls were lined with oil paintings of steamships and steelworks, trophies of an empire built on fire and labor. A grand staircase curved upward like a question mark, its banister polished to a mirror sheen. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. Jennie removed her gloves slowly, feeling as though she was shedding the last remnant of her old life. She had entered not a home but a realm, one built for power, not for warmth. Every surface gleamed, but nowhere did she see a place where she might rest. Even the air smelled of polish and distance. Edwin gestured toward a wide double door at the end of the hall. "Your rooms are prepared," he said. "If you require anything, the staff will see to it." Jennie inclined her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." For a heartbeat, he looked as though he might say more. His grey eyes softened, flickered, then shuttered again. He gave a slight nod and turned away, disappearing down another corridor lined with heavy velvet drapes. Left alone, Jennie climbed the staircase slowly, her hand trailing along the polished banister. She passed portraits of men in black coats, of women draped in silks, of factories lit by molten steel. At the landing, a large canvas caught her eye, a portrait of a woman with dark hair and a poised expression, wearing a sapphire necklace. She needed no introduction. The late Mrs. Rockwell watched her from the frame with cool detachment. Jennie paused, her fingers tightening on the railing. She felt not envy but a strange kinship, as though stepping into a life she had not been invited to, but was now expected to inhabit. She whispered to herself, almost without realizing, "I will not falter." In the quiet of her new chamber, a room heavy with velvet drapes and carved furniture, Jennie stood at the window and looked out over the snowy city. Somewhere below, the carriages still moved, carrying gossip and speculation to every corner of New York. Here, inside this grand house, she was Mrs. Rockwell. Yet she felt less like a wife than an intruder who had stumbled into a story not her own. She drew a deep breath and let it out slowly. Beyond the glass, snow continued to fall, veiling the city in white. Inside, the air seemed to wait, holding its breath with her. Winter lingered in New York City with a stubborn grace. Though the calendar whispered of spring, the wind off the Hudson still bit through the folds of wool cloaks, and the skies remained pale as porcelain. Inside the Rockwell mansion on Fifth Avenue, however, time moved differently. It did not follow the seasons, nor the clock. It followed the silence. A silence that echoed through marble halls and velvet-lined parlors, wrapped around columns of carved mahogany, and clung to Jennie like frost beneath her skin. As the new Mrs. Rockwell, Jennie moved through her days surrounded by opulence, yet untouched by warmth. The home was a monument to Edwin's empire, ceilings painted with cherubs and smoke, marble mantels imported from Italy, embroidered tapestries depicting industrial triumphs, and entire walls of glass cabinets filled with bronze models of bridges and trains. Everything gleamed, everything was perfect, and yet nowhere did she find a corner that felt like it belonged to her. In the mornings, Jennie took tea in the winter salon, where the windows faced the grey avenue. She was expected to keep up appearances, to attend society luncheons, make the occasional social call, and, when summoned, sit beside Edwin at business dinners held for investors or visiting dignitaries. Her gowns were selected by a discreet French modiste hired by Edwin's secretary. Her hair was styled by a maid with stiff hands and silent eyes. Her name was whispered with curiosity and disdain in every room she entered. The women of New York's high society did not speak to her with cruelty, at least not directly. They praised the cut of her gown, but never asked who made it. They nodded politely at her entrance, but forgot her name by the time they sipped their second cup of tea. Their words were honeyed, their smiles wide, their glances slicing. Jennie soon understood that she had not been accepted into this world, only observed. At the home of Mrs. Willoughby, an afternoon luncheon was held in support of some charitable endeavour Jennie could not remember afterward. Seated at the end of the table, surrounded by crystal and white roses, she had offered a modest opinion about expanding education for girls. The conversation froze for a heartbeat. Then one woman leaned closer, smiling sweetly, and said, "How charming that you're interested in such noble causes. Most of us are simply too occupied with matters of our own households." Laughter followed, light and graceful. Jennie smiled in return, her fingers tightening around her teacup, though her voice remained steady. "I imagine it takes great courage to look beyond one's own comfort." The silence that followed that sentence was not so graceful. Back at the mansion, Edwin's presence remained a flicker more than a flame. He was often away, at railroad meetings in Albany for political negotiations, in Pennsylvania overseeing new steel contracts. When he was home, he dined with her in the formal dining room, a space too vast for two people, where servants stood by like shadows and conversation remained shallow. He would ask after her schedule, compliment her attire in passing, but never linger long enough to touch the edges of her solitude. He was respectful, always. But the intensity she had once seen in his eyes, the fire of that moonlit conversation in the gallery, remained locked behind layers of duty and restraint. He seemed contained. Jennie began to wonder if she had imagined it entirely. It was on one such evening, after returning from a dinner at the home of a railroad commissioner's wife, that Jennie found herself drawn into the west wing of the mansion, a part of the house she had not explored. She moved through the corridor slowly, her fingers brushing against the wall. The door to the drawing room was ajar, and a faint glow flickered from within. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of amber and old wood. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, throwing shadows onto the parquet floor. On the far wall hung a portrait, large, commanding, and unmistakable. The woman in the painting was exquisite. Raven-haired, with porcelain skin and sapphire eyes, she was dressed in a gown of midnight blue, her slender neck adorned with a string of flawless pearls. Her expression was calm, proud, regal. Jennie stared at her for a long moment, feeling as though the room had grown colder in the space between heartbeats. She did not need to ask who it was. Mrs. Eleanor Rockwell, Edwin's late wife. The brushstrokes were gentle but precise. The painter had captured not only beauty, but presence. This woman had clearly belonged here. She had walked these halls, spoken with power, lived among chandeliers and politicians. Jennie stood very still, her hands clasped at her waist. As a strange weight settled over her, she could almost hear the soft rustle of silks, the murmur of remembered conversations echoing through the velvet drapes. For the first time since her wedding, Jennie felt like an intruder. "You're not the first to stand there like that," came a voice behind her. Jennie turned, startled. At the doorway stood Mrs. Genevieve Baxter, wrapped in a dark wool shawl, her silver hair pinned beneath a smart felt hat. Her face, aged and kind, held none of the mocking curiosity Jennie had grown used to. Her eyes were steady, wise, and, for once, genuinely interested. Jennie nodded in greeting, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't." Mrs. Baxter entered slowly, her cane tapping against the polished floor. "That room has been waiting for someone to disturb it. It's been far too quiet for far too long." Jennie turned back to the portrait. "She was, beautiful." "She was," the older woman replied without hesitation, "and clever and elegant, but not kind, not to everyone." Jennie glanced at her, uncertain. "I say this not to tarnish the dead," Mrs. Baxter said gently, lowering herself into a nearby chair, "but to remind you that portraits hang in houses, not hearts. You are not here to replace her, child. You are here to be yourself." Jennie sat across from her, the fire casting a warm light between them. "Why did he marry me?" she asked at last, the question barely above a breath. "I cannot offer what she did. I don't have her grace, her confidence, her bloodline. I'm a scandal wrapped in borrowed silk." Mrs. Baxter leaned forward, her voice low. "Perhaps it's because you don't offer what she did. Perhaps he saw in you something she never gave him, a kind of honesty that cannot be bought, a fire that does not burn for show." Jennie looked into the flames, her eyes reflecting gold and sorrow. "Do not underestimate this world, Jennie," the older woman continued. "It will smile at you with one hand and strangle you with the other. It will pretend to admire you, all while waiting for you to trip. But if you endure, if you remain true, you may outlast them all." Jennie nodded slowly, her heart aching with gratitude and uncertainty. As the fire crackled on, they sat in silence for a while, two women of different generations, joined by understanding. Later that night, in the privacy of her own chamber, Jennie stood before her mirror and removed her earrings one by one. Her reflection was pale, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. Yet beneath it all something had changed, something quiet but real. She was not the ghost of another woman. She would not compete with a memory. Nor would she bow to the false smiles of socialites who pretended not to remember her name. She was Jennie Rockwell, and though the walls around her were cold, gilded and echoing with history, she would carve her place within them, one silent step at a time. The frost had not yet left the streets of New York, but inside the parlors of Fifth Avenue, the air grew colder with every passing week. Jennie moved like a figure in a glass case, watched, speculated upon, but untouched. The grand halls of her new life were polished and silent, and the voices that once murmured behind fans now spoke in sharper tones, their whispers blooming into blades. It began with a letter, or rather, the absence of one. Clara Van Allen, radiant in the public eye and venomous behind closed doors, had announced a grand charity gala to benefit the widows and orphans of railway accidents, a cause Edwin had supported for years. Invitations were hand-delivered to every name that mattered. Lavish menus were printed in French, florists were summoned from Philadelphia, and musicians rehearsed beneath vaulted ceilings of gilded salons. But in the Rockwell mansion, no invitation arrived. Jennie waited without waiting. She saw the change in the staff's posture, the way the housekeeper paused before mentioning the event, then shifted the subject. At breakfast, Edwin read his paper with silent precision, the gala's details printed on the front page. Yet he said nothing. Jennie folded her napkin slowly, set it beside her untouched toast, and rose. In the days that followed, the omission made its rounds. Surely just an oversight, some said with false innocence. Perhaps the address was miswritten. But everyone knew the truth. It was not a mistake. It was a declaration. She was not welcome. Jennie did not cry. She did not ask Edwin why she had been excluded. Instead, she remained composed, her chin high, her gaze steady. She attended smaller events, where she was greeted with tepid civility and watched by eyes too curious to be kind. Her presence was tolerated, not embraced. But then came the second blow, quieter, crueler. Rumors whispered their way through the marble corridors of society, that Edwin had grown cold, that the marriage was hasty, regretted, soon to be corrected. A friend of a friend had heard it from a banker's wife who sat beside Edwin at a luncheon. He was distant, she had said, her voice dripping with conspiratorial delight. When asked about his wife, he simply changed the subject. It was enough. Enough to spark speculation. Enough to reignite Clara's campaign. Then came the forged letter. It arrived in a velvet envelope, placed upon a silver tray by the morning footman. Jennie had been arranging violets in a small vase in the drawing room when she was told Edwin wished to speak with her in his study. The chill in the butler's voice sent a shiver down her spine. She found Edwin standing by the tall window, the city skyline blurred behind frosted glass. The letter lay open on his desk. His shoulders were tense, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those grey-blue eyes, were dark with something she could not name. He turned slowly. "Did you write this?" Jennie stepped forward. The moment she saw the script, delicate, feminine, slightly slanted, her breath caught. "No," she said simply. "It is addressed to Baron Lucien d'Artois," he said, voice low, controlled. "Of the French embassy." Jennie looked up sharply. "I've never met him." "The letter speaks of regret," Edwin continued, "of a heart given too hastily, of a marriage entered without love." Jennie stepped closer. "It's a fabrication." He did not respond. His gaze searched her face, not with affection, but with the precision of a man accustomed to weighing truth against betrayal. She swallowed. "You think I wrote it?" "I think," he said, "that it exists." She drew herself up. "And that is enough for you to believe it." Edwin's jaw tensed. He turned away, his hand curling into a fist at his side. "The moment I announced our engagement," he said, "the vultures circled. I expected scandal. I expected resistance, but I did not expect deception inside my own home." Her voice wavered, not from fear, but from something deeper, wounded dignity. "If you had truly seen me that night, Edwin, if you had truly known who I was, then no letter, no rumor, would have planted doubt in your heart." He faced her again. This time there was a flicker of something behind the steel, not guilt, not yet, but hesitation. "I have been made a mockery," he said, his voice low. "This house, this name, were mocked long before I entered them." She interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "You are a man they tolerate, Edwin, not revere. You built this empire with your own hands, and yet they dine with you as though they dine with a stranger." Her words hung in the air like smoke. "I never asked for this life," she continued. "I never chased your fortune. You offered me your name, not your trust, and I accepted it with hope, not ambition." Edwin's breath caught. Jennie stepped closer. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "If you wish to believe lies whispered in velvet halls, then you may. But I will not defend myself against shadows. I will not grovel to prove I have never betrayed you." The silence between them pulsed with the weight of everything unspoken. And then something shifted. Edwin looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time since the ballroom, not as the scandal, not as the wife, but as the woman who had stood alone beneath chandeliers, unbowed and unafraid. Her voice softened. "You are not the only one who has been used as a weapon." He blinked. A breath, a beat. He stepped back, his hand running through his hair. "I don't know who to trust anymore," he admitted. Jennie exhaled slowly. "Then start with me." He said nothing more, but his silence was different now, not laced with judgment, but thick with thought. He walked past her, out of the room, leaving her alone with the letter. Jennie picked it up gently. The signature was a perfect imitation. The scent of violet ink clung to the page, but the words were not hers. They were cold, rehearsed, calculated. She folded it carefully and placed it in the fire. The flames curled around the parchment, devouring it silently. Later that night, she stood at the window of her chamber, watching the snow fall beneath the gaslight. The city shimmered with secrets, but in her heart there was a quiet defiance. She had not crumbled, she had not run, and perhaps, just perhaps, Edwin Rockwell had begun to see her not as a complication, but as something far more dangerous to the world that sought to destroy her. Unshakable, unbending, real. The wind over the East River blew sharp and bitter in the final weeks of March, as though winter were unwilling to surrender its dominion. Though the city stirred with whispers of spring, a grey stillness remained over its rooftops, and in the steel foundries of Rockwell and Co., that stillness was broken by the sound of industry, until it was broken by flames. It happened just past midnight. At the Red Hook facility, where men worked under iron beams and showers of sparks, the fire began with a hiss, quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it spread like betrayal, quick, hot, unforgiving. The night watchman barely had time to sound the alarm before the east wing exploded in a sheet of orange light that licked the sky like a dragon roused from sleep. Within hours, black smoke coiled above the city like morning lace, and by dawn, the news had reached every corner of Manhattan. Jennie read the headline with trembling hands. Fire at Rockwell Steel, sabotage suspected. She sat in the breakfast parlor. The light from the tall windows filtered through sheer curtains that trembled with the wind. The china cup in her hand remained untouched, the tea within growing cold. Edwin was already gone. He had received the telegram at dawn and departed in haste, leaving behind a trail of boot prints on the marble floor and a silence heavier than thunder. No word came for hours. Jennie paced the halls, stopping often at the window, her eyes scanning the horizon beyond the snow-dusted rooftops. She imagined the flames, the twisted iron, the cries of the injured. Her thoughts returned again and again to the men who labored in those factories, men she had never met, but who bore the weight of her husband's empire on their backs. By noon, unable to bear the waiting, she summoned her cloak. The carriage ride to the industrial district was jarring, each turn of the wheels echoing in her chest. Her maid tried to dissuade her, but Jennie's voice left no room for refusal. She wore no jewels, no hat adorned with silk or feathers, only a plain wool cloak, a simple pair of gloves, and a heart that beat too loudly with fear. The street outside the factory was chaos. Smoke still hung in the air, acrid and thick. Soot-blackened firemen shouted over the roar of the steam pumps, and carts arrived with buckets, blankets, and barrels of water. Workers, some bandaged, some bloody, sat on the curb or leaned against crates, their faces pale with shock. Among them stood Edwin, his coat stained with ash, his expression carved from stone. Jennie stepped down from the carriage without hesitation. The moment her feet touched the soot-covered ground, the murmurs began. That's her, Rockwell's wife. What's she doing here? She heard it all but did not falter. Lifting her skirts to avoid the puddles of melted snow and grime, she walked forward until she reached the group of injured men. One sat with his arm in a sling, his face streaked with blood and soot. Jennie knelt beside him without ceremony, pulling a clean handkerchief from her reticule. "May I?" she asked softly. The man stared at her, stunned. Then he nodded. She dabbed gently at his brow, the linen turning black in seconds. "Where is the doctor?" she asked one of the onlookers. "Busy inside," came the reply. "Too many." Jennie rose. "Then bring me water, and cloth, as much as you can." She moved from man to man, speaking gently, her hands steady. She held one man's fingers while his burns were wrapped, steadied another as he wept, not from pain, but from the shock of loss. No one stopped her, no one dared, and from the steps above, Edwin watched. At first he stood motionless, arms crossed, lips pressed into a hard line, but slowly as he watched his wife kneel in the mud beside his men, a change stirred in his eyes. She did not flinch at the blood. She did not cry when the steam scalded her hand. She did not pause when the foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a crushed leg, groaned from pain and humiliation. Instead, she took his hand in both of hers and said, You are not forgotten." Hours passed before Edwin approached her. The chaos had lessened, the fire smothered, the injured sent to hospitals. The air still smelled of smoke and ruin. Jennie was rinsing a cloth in a bucket when she felt his shadow beside her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. She turned, meeting his gaze. "Neither should they, and yet they are." He studied her face. Her cheeks were smudged with soot. A curl of hair had fallen loose beneath her bonnet, and her gloves were ruined. And yet, in that moment, she looked stronger than any woman he had ever known. "I didn't expect," he began, but stopped himself. Jennie tilted her head. "You didn't expect what?" He paused. Then softly, "This." She said nothing. She only looked at him, really looked at him, and in her eyes there was no triumph, no accusation, only a quiet resilience that both humbled and disarmed him. He cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said finally, the words thick on his tongue. Jennie nodded, then returned to her task. Edwin remained standing beside her longer than necessary, as though unable to turn away. That evening, back at the mansion, the staff looked at Jennie differently. The housekeeper greeted her with something almost like respect. The butler's voice had softened. Even the maid who helped remove her soot-streaked cloak did so with gentle hands. But outside those walls, the storm continued to gather. Clara Van Allen, her pride scorched by Jennie's public poise, sharpened her weapons. In a parlour lit by the flicker of brandy and envy, she met with Franklin Northcott, a railroad investor whose failed bid Edwin had publicly rejected the year before. "The fire weakens him," Clara whispered, swirling her glass. "He bleeds. Now is the moment to strike." Northcott raised a brow. "You wish to see him ruined?" "No," Clara smiled coldly. "I wish to see her ruined. He will survive. Men like him always do. But she was never meant to wear that name." They conspired beneath crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes, planning a social blow that would be swift, brutal, and public. As the invitations for the upcoming spring cotillion were written, Clara's hand guided more than names. It guided fate. She had a plan, and it sparkled with cruelty. But back in the mansion, Jennie sat in the blue salon, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup of tea. The flames in the hearth crackled, her gaze distant. She did not know what would come next, but for the first time she sensed that Edwin's gaze upon her had changed. Not entirely, not yet, but something had begun to shift, and perhaps, just perhaps, he was no longer looking through her, but at her. The days following the fire were colder, not in temperature but in silence, the kind of stillness that stretches taut over truth, waiting to snap. The Red Hook facility remained closed, charred beams and twisted iron, a testament to the magnitude of the damage. Though Edwin returned home each evening, his mind was still entangled with contracts, insurance claims, and internal investigations. But something unspoken lingered between him and Jennie now. Something fragile, like steam on glass. It was on the third morning that the envelope arrived. Unmarked, sealed with no crest, left not by footman or courier, but slipped quietly beneath the door of the Rockwell mansion's vestibule. The butler found it during his usual morning check, and seeing only Jennie's name written in a swift but elegant hand, brought it to her with visible hesitation. She opened it alone in the drawing room. The sunlight filtered through heavy damask curtains. The message was brief, unsigned. "You deserve to know who burned what he built. Follow the names in the ledger. Look to the Northcott accounts." Folded inside was a torn page from what appeared to be a financial ledger. The handwriting was neat, precise, and unmistakably familiar to anyone who frequented the circles of steel and steam. The name at the top chilled her blood: Clifford Van Allen, Clara's brother. Below it, entries for multiple wire transfers. Discrete sums moved between shell companies, one of which had recently purchased volatile chemicals traced back to the foundry fire. Jennie sat back in the chair, the note trembling in her hands. The fire had not been an accident. It had not been a business rival from another city. It had come from within their very circle, from those who toasted Edwin at dinners, praised him in public, and laughed with Clara behind closed doors. She could have burned the letter, could have handed it to a servant, claimed ignorance, let Edwin uncover it himself. But she did not. Instead, Jennie rose, dressed in her walking gown, and requested to see her husband in his study. The request alone startled the staff. Edwin looked up from his desk as she entered, his brows drawn together, the smell of ink and tobacco clinging to the room. He was surrounded by papers, blueprints, and telegrams. His cravat was loosened, his waistcoat unbuttoned. He looked exhausted but alert, like a man perpetually on the verge of war. Jennie did not sit. She held the envelope in both hands and extended it to him. "What is this?" he asked, frowning as he took it. "I don't know who sent it," she replied, her voice low but unwavering. "But it names the Van Allen family, Clifford specifically." His eyes narrowed as he unfolded the paper. As he read, the color drained slowly from his face. The silence thickened. Then, without a word, he stood and crossed the room to the window. His posture was rigid, as though holding back something explosive. Jennie waited. When he finally turned, his expression was a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You understand what this means?" he asked, voice taut. "I do. If this is true, if this ledger is authentic, they destroyed the east wing of my foundry. They injured 12 men, killed 2, just to damage my name. And they did it," Jennie said softly, "while dining at your table, while smiling in our direction at the opera, while gossiping in their salons." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not with guarded detachment, but with something raw and shaken. "And you brought this to me," he murmured. "I could not stay silent," she said. "Not if I wish to live in truth. Not if I respect what you've built." There was a pause. Something shifted in his gaze. "You knew the risk," he said. "That if this fell into the wrong hands, the press would devour you. They'd say you forged it, that you fabricated it to destroy your rival." "I don't care," she answered. "Let them. I care more for justice than appearances." Edwin stepped closer. "You would risk your reputation. For me, I would risk it," she said slowly, "for what is right." That silence returned, but now it pulsed with something deeper, something alive, a thread that bound breath to breath. Then, without warning, Edwin reached out and gently cupped her cheek. His hand was warm, rough from years of work, and his thumb brushed the soft skin just beneath her eye. "You amaze me," he whispered. Jennie's breath caught. "You stand in rooms that were never meant for you," he continued, "and you make them yours without asking. You survive them with grace, with strength. And now you protect what I've built as if it were your own." Her eyes shimmered, but she did not speak. She only met his gaze with the same quiet resilience that had drawn him in from the beginning. Edwin leaned in. The kiss was not hurried, not a gesture of duty or performance, but something long delayed, something that rose between them slowly, like heat in winter. It was tender, searching, filled with unsaid things and trembling truths. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers for a long moment. The air between them changed. From that moment, the world outside their doors would continue to whisper, but within the Rockwell mansion, something new had begun. That evening, the city glittered with gaslight as carriages lined the avenue for the spring cotillion. It was the event of the season, lavish, opulent, filled with the scent of imported lilies and the sound of strings echoing beneath crystal chandeliers. And into that ballroom, Jennie Rockwell stepped on Edwin's arm, dressed in sapphire silk. The gown hugged her frame with understated elegance, the color matching the depth of her eyes and the quiet power of her presence. Her hair, arranged in a modest yet regal twist, was adorned only with a silver comb. She wore no diamonds, no tiara. She did not need them. Gasps fluttered through the room like startled birds. There she was, the woman the papers had mocked, the one society had tried to ignore, then slander, then erase. And yet she stood taller than ever, her gaze steady, her smile poised. Edwin led her into the ballroom with confidence, his hand resting lightly at her back. He did not glance at Clara, who stood beneath a towering display of white roses in a gown of emerald satin. But Jennie did. Their eyes met. Clara smiled, sharp as glass, but behind it was a flicker, brief but real, of unease. Jennie did not return the smile. She did not need to. As the orchestra began a waltz, Edwin turned to his wife. "May I have this dance?" Jennie inclined her head, placing her gloved hand in his. They stepped onto the floor, and as they moved across the marble beneath the glow of 1,000 candles, Jennie felt the eyes of the room upon her. But now, for the first time, she did not feel judged. She felt seen, admired, feared, for she was no longer merely the poor girl in the wrong dress, nor the scandalous wife of a magnate. She had stood in the fire and emerged forged, not in silk or gossip, but in steel. The late spring sun filtered through the beveled glass windows of the Astoria Ladies' Social Council, casting long ribbons of gold across the polished mahogany table where the city's most prominent matrons now sat, laced gloves folded primly, expressions carved in porcelain resolve. The air inside was cool and dry, yet electric with expectation. Whispers had trailed Jennie for days, cruel and barbed, and today the whisper had a name: Clara Van Allen. Jennie sat alone at the far end of the chamber, flanked by no friend or ally, wearing a simple navy walking dress with mother-of-pearl buttons and a delicate straw hat resting in her lap. Her hands were steady, though her heart pounded with a quiet ache. Across from her sat Mrs. Langley, Mrs. Caldwell, and Mrs. Merriweather, 3 women whose gloved fingers had woven the invisible web of social power in New York for more than a decade. Clara had arrived moments before, draped in mauve silk and foxed with triumph. Her chin was high, her smile faint. She sat beside her mother and 2 attorneys, though this was no courtroom. This was something far more savage. A matter of propriety and truth. Mrs. Caldwell had begun, her voice cool as winter crystal. "It has come to our attention, Mrs. Rockwell, that certain claims regarding your ancestry and family name may be embellished." Jennie did not speak. She had known this moment would come. Clara stood, her fingers gliding over the edge of the table. "It was I who brought this to light," she said. "With regret, of course, but society must protect itself from deception." She drew from her satchel a small envelope and placed it delicately on the table. A letter from a genealogical archivist in Boston. According to his records, no such Whitford line traces nobility as claimed. In fact, the Whitfords were land clerks, nothing more. There are no titles, no inheritance, no social merit. Jennie's eyes did not leave Clara's. "And?" she asked softly. A hush fell. Even the rustle of silk seemed to hold its breath. "You made claims of heritage in your marriage announcement," Clara pressed. "You were introduced under false pretense. That makes your position questionable, perhaps even invalid." Mrs. Langley raised a brow. "We must be careful, Miss Van Allen. These are heavy implications." Clara's smile did not waver. "She deceived the city, and your trust. This, paired with the earlier rumors, her supposed forged correspondence to a suitor, the unprovable accusations against my family regarding that unfortunate fire, suggests a pattern." Jennie slowly rose to her feet. She did not defend herself with gestures. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but unshaking. "I never claimed nobility," she said. "Only lineage. My great-grandfather served in the Continental Congress. My grandfather was a man of letters. We lost our estate after the Panic of '57. There are no titles in my name, no lands. I came to the city with one dress and no illusions." Mrs. Merriweather frowned. "Then why not clarify such things?" Jennie looked straight at Clara. "Because I never had the opportunity to speak without someone else twisting my silence." The silence that followed was heavy with weight. Clara made to respond, but the doors opened, before she could utter a word. Edwin Rockwell entered, tall and composed, his expression unreadable. The light from the corridor gilded his shoulders, and every head turned. Even the matron stood, out of respect more than habit. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice like flint, "but I cannot allow this farce to continue without correction." He walked slowly toward the end of the room, where Jennie remained standing, her gaze unwavering. "There is something you all should know," he continued, looking at each face in turn. "My wife made no claim to grandeur. She did not seek me. She did not beg for a place in your parties, your parlors, or your gossip columns." He turned slightly toward Clara. "But you, Miss Van Allen, have spun a web so tangled with envy, I'm surprised you remember where it began." Clara flushed. Her lips parted to object, but Edwin lifted a hand, elegant, firm, final. "I was not born a Rockwell," he said then. "My name was Edwin Carter, son of a blacksmith in Pennsylvania. I earned my fortune in the forges, not in a cradle. I changed my surname to Rockwell at 20 after my first factory contract to disassociate from the past that society deems improper." A murmur swept through the room. "I married Jennie not because of her name, but because of her courage. Because while the rest of you held lorgnettes and whispered behind fans, she walked through fire, my fire, and stood with dignity. She's more noble in her silence than any title could make her." Edwin turned to Jennie then and offered her his hand, not theatrically, but with the solemnity of a vow. "If that disqualifies her from your luncheons or your dances," he said, "then I suggest you reconsider who truly belongs at your table." No one moved. Mrs. Langley cleared her throat. "Well, this changes matters." But it was Clara who broke the silence, by storming from the room, chin high but eyes shimmering with shame. She left New York by steamer 2 days later, the society columns describing it as a sabbatical to Europe for her health. But everyone knew the truth. She had gambled everything on Jennie's downfall, and lost. Outside, the air smelled of lilacs and the faint drift of coal smoke. Jennie stood beside Edwin on the marble steps, the city unfolding beneath them like a painting touched by wind. "You shouldn't have come," she said quietly. He turned to her. "I was late once. I won't be again." Jennie looked away, but her lips trembled. Edwin gently reached for her gloved hand. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "You never had to prove yourself to them. You've already proven yourself to me." She blinked, the tears threatening but held back. Her fingers tightened just slightly around his. For the first time, she did not feel like the poor cousin, nor the scandalous wife, nor the woman who had stood alone in a ballroom of wolves. She felt like what she had become, the wife of a man who saw her worth before the world ever did. A woman who stood tall even as others tried to bend her. A lady forged not in silk, but in steel. And New York, glittering, roaring, unrelenting, finally, reluctantly bent its gaze in reverence. The early summer sun spilled golden light across the garden behind the Rockwell mansion, brushing the hedgerows and marble statues with the soft radiance of late June. Magnolia blossoms trembled in the breeze, releasing their sweet, heavy perfume into the morning air. Birds fluttered in the ivy-clad trellises. It was a quiet morning, unmarked by scandal, untouched by society's gaze, and yet it was the most sacred of days. In a clearing framed by white roses and lilac bushes, Jennie stood beneath a wrought-iron arch, dressed in a gown of pale sky-blue silk, simple but elegant, with a neckline modestly trimmed in white lace. Her dark chestnut hair was pinned in soft waves, a few tendrils loose at her temple. She held no bouquet, she needed no veil. The woman who waited in that garden had no need to hide. Edwin stood before her, solemn and sure. He wore a cream waistcoat beneath his tailored morning coat, a sapphire pin at his cravat, a quiet echo of the gift he would give her later that day. His hands were clasped behind his back, but his eyes never left hers. There were no guests, no judges, no ministers to remind them of what was owed. Only Mrs. Baxter, seated at a respectful distance, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She had insisted on being present. As a witness, she said, not of legality, but of the heart. Jennie took a small step forward. I never expected this, she said softly. Not the name, not the fortune, not you. Edwin's voice was husky. You were never the one who wore masks, Jennie. I did. For years. They stood for a moment, letting the silence carry the weight of what had been. Then, in a voice low and trembling, Edwin spoke the words he had written himself. I offer you no promises of perfection, he said, but I offer you truth. I offer you all that I am, not as Rockwell the magnate nor Edwin the widower, but as a man who finally sees clearly. Jennie swallowed, emotion rising in her throat. Her hands trembled as she took his. I don't want perfection, she whispered. Only the chance to build something honest, something earned. He slid a plain gold ring onto her finger. She did the same. And when their lips met, it was not under chandeliers or in front of a crowd, but beneath a whispering birch tree where no one else existed. That afternoon, Jennie walked alone into the grand offices of the New York Charity Guild and signed the deed to a new hospital wing in the name of the Rockwell Foundation. She had already secured the land, an old plot near the factories in the Lower East Side, and commissioned the finest architects. It won't bear Edwin's name, she told the committee. It will bear mine, not for vanity, but for the women who must be seen, for the children who deserve better than shadows, for the men who build our world and are too easily forgotten. By week's end, the same newspapers that once called her an opportunist now wrote headlines hailing Mrs. Rockwell's philanthropy, unmatched in elegance and spirit. Editorials praised her as the new face of womanhood, graceful, purposeful, unbowed by social warfare. But it wasn't praise Jennie sought. That evening, as twilight folded gently over Fifth Avenue, Edwin found her in the drawing room, seated at the pianoforte. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, unmoving. He approached without a sound, something small wrapped in a silk handkerchief in his hand. When my mother died, he said softly, my father gave me this, told me it was hers, passed down from a grandmother I never knew. I've never given it to anyone, not even my first wife. He unwrapped the handkerchief and revealed a sapphire brooch set in a halo of pearls. The deep blue stone gleamed like twilight captured in a jewel. Jennie reached out, her fingertips brushing it. I can't wear this, she murmured. But you must, he said, because you are my legacy now. He fastened it gently to the silk at her shoulder, his fingers lingering. That night, the chandeliers of the Rockwell ballroom sparkled once more, the same ballroom where they had first met, where whispers had once bruised her spirit. But now the room was filled not with strangers, but with music, with warmth, with light. Edwin offered her his hand, and Jennie took it, her fingers steady. They danced alone. No orchestra, no audience, just two hearts, unburdened at last. Her cheek against his shoulder, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. He smelled faintly of tobacco and bergamot, and something she had come to know as home. And later, when the music faded and the candles burned low, Jennie walked to the tall window that overlooked the garden. She placed her palm on the cool glass, her reflection illuminated by moonlight. Gone was the girl in the ivory gown, shaking with shame. Gone was the woman mocked, accused, and tested. In her place stood someone else entirely, a wife loved not out of obligation, but out of truth, a woman whose name, once dismissed, now opened doors, not just for herself, but for others. Jennie Whitford Rockwell had not only survived the Gilded Age, she had conquered it, with grace, with steel. The garden at the Rockwell estate had grown fuller over the years. The rose bushes had climbed higher, their branches stretching over trellises with quiet pride, and the birch tree beneath which Edwin and Jennie had renewed their vows now stood broader, its trunk solid, its leaves 1,000 whispers in the afternoon breeze. It was early June again. Children's laughter echoed through the hedges, 2 boys, twins of 9, chasing a striped ball through the green with all the urgency and freedom of youth. Their pale blonde curls and sharp grey eyes were a curious blend of Jennie's warmth and Edwin's cool precision. Their governess called after them, but they paid her no mind. They were Rockwells, after all, born of fire and grace. From the terrace, Jennie watched them with a soft smile, her hands folded over the embroidered shawl draped around her shoulders. Time had refined her. There were silver strands now woven into her chestnut hair, and faint lines at the corners of her eyes, but they were lines born of laughter and endurance, not regret. She sat with Mrs. Baxter, who had never truly left. Though older and thinner now, the matron's wit remained sharp as ever. She still called Jennie child, though Jennie herself now chaired the city's most influential charitable board and hosted dignitaries without blinking. "Society tried to break you, and now it begs to dine at your table," Mrs. Baxter said dryly, sipping her tea. Jennie chuckled. "They forget quickly." "No," Mrs. Baxter replied. "They remember, but they rewrite. It's easier that way." Edwin joined them shortly after, a touch of grey at his temples, but his stride as commanding as ever. He had stepped back from day-to-day operations of the Steel Empire, passing many responsibilities to a trusted circle, but he remained its heart, still fierce, still brilliant, still hers. He leaned to press a kiss to Jennie's cheek, murmuring, "The boys nearly broke a window." Jennie laughed. "Let them. They're strong." He took her hand then, just as he had 10 years before, and gave it a gentle squeeze, as their mother is. In the city beyond the gates, New York had changed. Factories now offered better wages, and the hospital wing Jennie had commissioned had grown into a full institution, bearing her name over the marble columns, the Whitford Rockwell Medical Pavilion for labourers and families. Her name was now spoken with reverence, not scandal. Not everyone had fared as well. Clara Van Allen had returned from Europe 5 years earlier, her fortune splintered and her reputation permanently marred. She lived quietly now in Newport, unmarried and rarely seen at social events. Jennie had once received a letter, unsigned but unmistakably hers, apologizing not for the cruelty, but for the emptiness it left behind. Jennie had never replied. Some stories, she believed, were better left unread. As the sun began to set, Edwin led Jennie into the ballroom once more, now used only for special evenings. The chandeliers were dimmed to a golden glow. The parquet floor was warm underfoot. A phonograph played a familiar waltz, and instinctively they moved to the rhythm. He drew her into his arms, and she fit there, as she always had, not with uncertainty, but with peace. "I once asked you," Edwin whispered, "if you'd take my name, even if the world hated you for it." Jennie rested her head against his shoulder, her voice a breath. "And I did. And now?" She pulled back slightly to meet his gaze. "Now the world loves me for it. But I loved you before any of that mattered." "Yee!" He smiled then, truly smiled, and they danced in silence. A man who had built an empire with his bare hands, and a woman who had once stood in the shadows of a marble ballroom with a dress that did not belong to her. Now they belonged only to each other. When the music faded, Jennie walked to the tall window once again, just as she had on the night that changed everything. But this time she did not see a city to conquer. She saw one she had shaped, and in her heart she carried no anger, no vengeance, only gratitude for every door slammed in her face, for each one had led her here, to a home, to a husband, to love that had withstood ridicule, fire, loss, and time. Jennie Whitford Rockwell had not only endured the Gilded Age, she had become its soul. There are stories that entertain, And there are stories that stay with you. Jennie's journey is one of those. From humiliation to honor, from whispered mockery to a love that defied every rule of Gilded Age society, this is more than a romance. It's a testament to resilience, to dignity, and to the quiet courage of a woman who chose grace over bitterness, strength over surrender. Jennie Whitford Rockwell wasn't born with power. She earned it. Not with wealth or influence, but with her heart, her integrity, and her refusal to let others define her worth. And isn't that the lesson we all need to remember? That no matter where we come from or what others may say, our value is not up for negotiation. If you felt something while listening to this story, if you rooted for Jennie, if you held your breath when Edwin crossed the ballroom, if your heart swelled when they danced alone as husband and wife, then I invite you to leave a single word in the comments: steal. Let that be our secret signal that you walked this path with her, all the way to the end. Please, don't keep this journey to yourself. Share it with someone who still believes in the power of love, second chances, and emotional triumphs. And if you're craving more stories like this, take a look at the other historical romances linked in the cards. We've saved you a seat at the next ballroom. Thank you for joining us. Until the next unforgettable tale.